The wind carried the smell of gunpowder across the valley that morning. Horses neighed in panic. Somewhere behind the ridge, a child was crying, and in the cold November air of 1872, Captain Jack stood on a ridge overlooking Lost River, knowing that peace had already died. This was not how it was supposed to end. Just months earlier, he had begged the U.S. government for one small piece of land, a place where his people could live in peace. Instead, soldiers came with rifles and orders. He had been called a rebel, a murderer, a savage. But Jack was none of those things. He was a man defending the only home he had ever known. Long before the first gunshot, the Modoc people thrived in harmony with their land. Their villages sat beside Tule Lake and Lost River, where mist rose at dawn and cranes took flight over still waters. They fished, hunted, and gathered roots beneath a sky untouched by smoke. To the Modoc, the earth was sacred. The wind carried the voices of ancestors. The fire held stories of creation. Every sunrise was a gift, every river a prayer. But their peace would soon be disturbed by the sound of wagon wheels and foreign tongues. When white settlers first crossed the Oregon Trail, they came hungry for land and gold. The Modoc watched them with wary curiosity. At first, they traded, fish for tools, hides for blankets. But trade turned to tension as more wagons rolled in, carving roads through Modoc hunting grounds. By 1852, misunderstanding became massacre. Dozens of Modoc were killed at Bloody Point by settlers seeking revenge for lost emigrants. Children were orphaned, villages burned. From that day, a quiet oath was whispered across the tribe. Never again would they kneel before outsiders. 12 years later, U.S. officials came with papers and promises. The Treaty of 1864 forced the Modoc to share a reservation with the Klamath, their long-standing rivals. The land was poor, the winters harsh, and food scarce. Humiliation followed. The Klamath mocked them, calling them squatters on their own soil. Modoc elders starved, children fell ill, and resentment grew. From those ashes, a leader began to rise, a young man named Kientpoos, whom settlers would soon call Captain Jack. Captain Jack was not a man of rage. He was quiet, sharp-eyed, and thoughtful, the kind of leader who spoke softly but carried the respect of warriors. He believed in peace but refused to let his people die in silence. When an elder woman died of starvation on the reservation, Jack's patience broke. He stood before the agent and said, "We are going home, to our river." That night, under the stars, the Modoc packed what they could and began their journey back to Lost River. The valley looked the same, yet everything had changed. Fences now cut through the plains. Settlers' houses stood where Modoc lodges once stood. Still, Captain Jack's people built new homes near Lost River, believing they could coexist in peace. But peace never came. Complaints poured in from settlers demanding soldiers to remove the savages. Jack pleaded with the government to grant his people a small reservation near their ancestral ground. His words went unanswered. He did not know it yet, but the war had already begun, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of men. On November 29, 1872, soldiers under Major Elijah Green arrived to arrest Captain Jack. The morning was cold, the sky heavy with fog. What began as a tense conversation soon turned into chaos. A gun went off. No one knew who fired first. Smoke filled the air. Warriors fought back. Women screamed. Horses bolted. When the dust settled, soldiers and Modoc alike lay dead. Captain Jack led his people south through the marshes, clutching the wounded. Behind them, the fires of war burned over Lost River. The fleeing Modoc reached the lava beds, a twisted landscape of sharp black rock and hidden caves. To others, it was a wasteland. To them, it was salvation. Here, the Modoc would make their stand. Only 55 warriors stood against more than 1,000 U.S. troops. But the lava beds were alive. The ground itself seemed to fight for them. When the army attacked in January 1873, the Modoc vanished among the rocks, striking from the shadows. The soldiers retreated in shock, 37 dead, none of them Modoc. Newspapers called it the Lava Fortress of Death. For months, the Modoc held their ground. Inside the caves, they cooked with smokeless fires and prayed to the spirits for strength. Captain Jack paced silently, torn between survival and surrender. Outside, the army regrouped with reinforcements and cannons, yet among the soldiers, whispers grew, "How can so few fight so well?" Still, Jack longed for peace. He sent word to the army. He was willing to talk. Perhaps, he hoped, there was still a way to end the bloodshed without losing his soul. In April 1873, the government sent General Edward Canby, Alfred Meacham, and Eleanor Meacham to negotiate. They rode under a white flag toward the lava beds. Captain Jack met them with a heavy heart. He wanted peace, but his own warriors, angry and starving, demanded blood. Hooker Jim whispered that if Jack did not kill Canby, they would kill him. The leader, who had always sought mercy, was cornered by his own people's fury. As the sun rose over the jagged rocks, history waited in silence. The next meeting would decide whether peace lived or died. April 11th, 1873. The sky was pale, the air still. Captain Jack walked toward the peace tent with trembling hands. Around him, his warriors watched in silence, faces tight with anger and despair. General Edward Canby stood tall, unarmed, trusting in the promise of a white flag. "Lay down your guns," he said gently. "You'll be treated fairly." But Jack's heart pounded with terror and guilt. He begged once more for a homeland at Lost River. Canby refused. Then, in a flash of panic and pressure, Jack drew his pistol and fired. The shot echoed across the lava beds. Canby fell. Peace was dead. Screams erupted as chaos tore through the negotiation site. Boston Charley stabbed Reverend Thomas, while Hooker Jim fired wildly. Meacham lay wounded, barely alive. The Modoc fled back into the lava fortress, knowing what they had done could never be undone. Captain Jack's face was pale with shock. "I did not want this," he whispered, staring at his trembling hands. By sundown, word reached Washington. The nation was outraged. The killing of a general under a white flag was called murder, not war. The army swore vengeance. The U.S. government moved swiftly. Thousands of troops poured into Modoc country under General Jefferson C. Davis. Cannons and mortars thundered against the lava rocks. The Modoc, fewer than 60 warriors, fought back with deadly precision. Every crevice became a defense, every stone a shield. Soldiers called it hell on earth. For the Modoc, it truly was. Children hid in caves, their cries muffled beneath blankets as shells exploded outside. But Captain Jack refused to surrender. "They can kill me," he said, "but they will never own my spirit." Weeks passed. Food ran out. Smoke choked the air. The once mighty lava fortress grew silent except for the coughing of the weak. The Modoc women boiled roots and lizards for survival. Warriors sharpened dull blades, their strength fading. Yet their resolve held strong. Captain Jack sat at the mouth of a cave, staring at the stars through the rising smoke. "I asked for peace," he murmured, "and they sent war." In late April 1873, the army launched another massive attack. Artillery fire shook the ground. Lava shards flew through the air like daggers. For hours, gunfire echoed through the rocks. The Modoc fought until the last bullet, then slipped away under darkness, disappearing like ghosts. When dawn broke, the soldiers found the stronghold empty, but the ground was littered with their own dead. The Modoc had vanished again. Inside the wilderness, division grew. Hooker Jim accused Captain Jack of weakness, saying, "You brought this war and cannot finish it." Jack, weary and grief-stricken, refused to argue. "I never wanted blood," he said. "Only home." The Modoc camp split. Some followed Hooker Jim and others stayed with Jack. What the U.S. Army could not destroy with bullets. Fear and starvation began to tear apart from within. By May, Hooker Jim and his followers were exhausted and desperate. They surrendered to the army, hoping for mercy. But the generals wanted more. They wanted Captain Jack. Hooker Jim offered a deal: freedom for himself in exchange for helping them find his leader. It was a betrayal born of survival. The man who once fought beside Jack now led soldiers toward his hiding place. Captain Jack fled deeper into the barren wilderness, his small band dwindling. The army followed, guided by Modoc traders. The land itself seemed cursed, heat rising from the rocks, blood staining the dust. Each night, Jack looked at the weary faces of his people. "If we stop, they will kill us all," he told them. But even he knew the end was close. On June 1st, 1873, surrounded by soldiers, Captain Jack stood quietly as the last of his people laid down their weapons. There was no speech, no surrender flag, only silence. A soldier later wrote, "He faced us like a man who had already made peace with death." They bound his hands, but he held his head high. His war was over, but his dignity remained untouched. The prisoners were marched to Fort Klamath. Soldiers and settlers lined the roads, shouting curses. Jack walked in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon. At the fort, they were locked in wooden cells. Captain Jack prayed for his people and for forgiveness. One night, he said softly to Boston Charley, "Maybe one day they will know we fought only for home." At Fort Klamath, Captain Jack stood before a military tribunal of white officers. His hands were bound, yet his gaze never faltered. The courtroom was cold, filled with soldiers, reporters, and whispers. The charge was murder for the death of General Canby. When asked if he understood the accusation, Jack nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, "but I did what I thought would save my people." His words hung heavy in the air. Witness after witness spoke. Some soldiers called him a monster, others a man of courage. Even Alfred Meekum, who had survived the peace meeting, spoke for mercy. "Captain Jack was no villain," Meekum said. "He was a man trapped between hope and despair." But mercy found no place in the courtroom that day. The verdict was already written in the nation's anger. On July 8, 1873, Captain Jack and 3 others, Boston Charley, Black Jim, and Schonchin John, were sentenced to death by hanging. When the interpreter read the sentence aloud, Jack bowed his head, then looked up and said quietly, "I am not afraid to die. My heart is strong." His courage silenced even the guards. Outside the fort, Modoc women wept softly, their cries carried away by the wind. The night before the hanging, the camp was eerily silent. A soldier claimed he heard Captain Jack praying softly in Modoc, his voice calm and low. He prayed not for his life, but for his people, for the children taken, for the dead unburied in the lava fields. He ended his prayer with a whisper, "I hope the Great Spirit will understand." On October 3, 1873, the gallows stood ready. Soldiers surrounded the square, their faces grim. Captain Jack walked forward with slow, steady steps. The rope hung like a serpent waiting to strike. Before the hood was placed over his head, he turned to the crowd and said, "I tried to make peace. You would not listen." Moments later, the trapdoor opened and silence followed. When the bodies were cut down, soldiers removed Captain Jack's head and sent it to Washington for study, a cruel trophy of conquest. The Modoc who remained alive were forced to watch as their leader's body was buried far from home. For them, it was not just a man who had died, but an entire world, the last breath of Modoc freedom. A few weeks later, the surviving Modoc, men, women, and children, were forced to march over 1,000 miles to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. They traveled through rain, sickness, and hunger. Many died along the way. Those who reached the camps were too weak to speak. They stared into the endless plains, whispering the names of the lakes and rivers they would never see again. In Oklahoma, the Modoc lived under harsh conditions. The land was foreign. No lava, no lakes, no home. They built small huts and tried to survive, teaching their children stories of Tule Lake, Lost River, and the man called Captain Jack. When the rains came, elders said the thunder was the voice of their ancestors, calling them back to the mountains of the north. Decades passed. The Modoc in exile endured poverty and neglect. Many died without ever returning home. But the stories survived, carried in songs, in whispered prayers, in the rhythm of drums that still echoed through their descendants. In Oregon and California, their homeland grew quiet, but the spirits of the fallen were never silent. More than a century later, historians and descendants began to tell the Modoc story again, not as rebellion, but as resistance. The lava beds, once a fortress of war, became a national monument. Visitors still walk among the rocks where Captain Jack made his stand. And when the wind moves through the caverns, some say you can still hear his voice, calm, proud, and unbroken, whispering, "I fought for home." The Oklahoma sun was merciless. The Modoc, once surrounded by rivers and volcanic cliffs, now lived in a flat, dry land that knew no mercy. Children asked their elders, "Where is Tule Lake? Where are the mountains?" The elders pointed north and said, "Far away, but in our hearts, still there." Time passed slowly. The Modoc learned to farm small plots of corn and beans. They attended missionary schools, forced to speak English and forget their tongue. Yet at night, around dying fires, old songs returned. The children whispered Captain Jack's name like a secret prayer. They did not know his face, but they knew his story. In 1909, an old Modoc woman named Toby Riddle, once called Winema, died quietly. She had been a bridge between two worlds, the interpreter who had saved Alfred Meacham's life during the peace talks. Her death marked the end of an era, but before she closed her eyes, she whispered, "Tell them we were not savages. We were people who loved our home." By the early 1900s, textbooks called the Modoc War a rebellion. Teachers spoke of savage Indians who defied progress. But among the Modoc descendants, truth survived. Elders corrected their children. "We did not rebel, we resisted." Those words became the seed of pride that would someday grow again. In 1909, for the first time since exile, a small group of Modoc descendants were allowed to visit Oregon. They stood among the black stones of the Lava Beds National Monument. The wind howled through the same caves where Captain Jack had once stood. Some fell to their knees, touching the earth and weeping. "We are home," one said, "even if only for a moment." As the decades passed, Modoc voices began to rise again. They fought for tribal recognition, for the right to be remembered not as ghosts, but as a living people. In both Oklahoma and Oregon, councils formed to preserve stories, language, and culture. Though separated by distance, they shared one dream: to reunite the Modoc Nation. By mid-century, two Modoc communities existed, one in Oregon, one in Oklahoma. Each carried half a soul, but the same heartbeat. They exchanged letters, artifacts, and songs. The old stories of Captain Jack became lessons for new generations. The tale of defiance turned into a symbol of survival. In the 1950s, a historian visited the Modoc in Oklahoma. He was astonished by their memory. Elders still spoke of Lost River, the lava beds, and the Great War. When he asked an old man what the name Captain Jack meant to him, the elder smiled faintly. "It means courage," he said, "and pain, but also home." The next generation of Modoc descendants attended American schools, worked in towns, and served in wars. Yet on weekends they gathered to dance and drum, keeping the ancient rhythm alive. They were Americans. but also Modoc. Between two worlds, they carried the story of a man who refused to bow, even when the world called him enemy. By the 1970s, the Modoc language, nearly forgotten, began to return. Teachers worked from old notes, and songs once sung in whispers were now recorded. Children learned to say Maclax again, the people. And when they spoke of Captain Jack, they no longer whispered. They spoke with pride. The song of the Modoc had returned, carried by wind and memory back to the land of stone and fire. The 1980s brought winds of change. For the Modoc in Oklahoma and Oregon, the dream of reunion grew stronger. Elders said the spirits of the lava beds were calling them home. Delegations began visiting the old homeland again, walking through the same blackened rocks, laying down sage, and speaking the names of their ancestors into the wind. During one visit, a Modoc descendant named William G. Riddle, a great-grandson of Winnemaw, stood on the ridge above Tule Lake. He spoke softly, "We do not come as conquerors or mourners. We come as children returning home." For the first time in over a century, both Modoc and local residents stood together, honoring the truth of what had happened on that land. In 1978, after decades of effort, the Modoc Tribe of Oklahoma finally received federal recognition. It was a victory born of patience, prayer, and perseverance. They elected their own council, created schools, and revived ceremonies long banned. For the first time since exile, the Modoc Nation could speak officially as a people again. Recognition was more than paperwork. It was healing. Descendants of those once divided by war now met at gatherings, sharing songs that had survived on different tongues. In Oregon, caretakers of the Lava Beds National Monument welcomed the Modoc home for ceremonies. Tears and drums filled the air where gunfire had once thundered. Rangers and historians began preserving the old battlefields with care. Signs marked Captain Jack's stronghold, Gillam's camp, and the peace tent site. Visitors walked the trails and felt the weight of history beneath their feet. The land seemed to breathe, carrying echoes of war, sorrow, and pride. In the 1990s, schools in both Oklahoma and Oregon began teaching the Modoc War as part of Native American history. Where textbooks once called them rebels, now they were called defenders of homeland. Young students watched documentaries, read letters, and learned that history was not black and white. It was human, painful, and powerful. Elders and linguists worked side by side to bring the Modoc language back from silence. They recorded words, phrases, and songs that had nearly vanished. Children learned to greet each other with mokishta, hello. They learned the word shuyu, home. Each word spoken was a small victory over centuries of silence. In the early 2000s, members of the Modoc Tribe of Oklahoma and the Klamath Modoc descendants in Oregon gathered together for the first major reunion. Elders embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Drums sounded beneath the same sky where their ancestors had once fought and died. A young Modoc girl recited a poem. "We are the children of Captain Jack. The fire did not destroy us. It made us strong." Today, Captain Jack is remembered not as a villain, but as a man trapped by impossible choices. Historians see his defiance as a cry for justice, not rebellion. Statues and memorials bear his name. His story appears in books, classrooms, and films, the tale of a leader who faced an empire with courage and heartbreak. At sunset, the Lava Beds National Monument glows red and gold. Visitors walk quietly through the stronghold, feeling the ghostly calm of the battlefield. Ravens circle overhead. The air is still. Somewhere among the rocks, the spirit of Captain Jack lingers, proud, calm, eternal. The war ended long ago, but his story still breathes through the stones. The 21st century dawned quietly, but for the Modoc people, it felt like sunrise after a long night. No longer silenced or forgotten, they stood as proof that identity could survive even the harshest exile. The same courage that had carried Captain Jack through the lava beds now flowed through his descendants. Young Modoc children in Oklahoma recited stories of their ancestors in classrooms filled with laughter and pride. They learned not just dates and names, but meaning, why their people fought and what they stood for. One teacher said, "When you speak Captain Jack's name, speak it with respect. He was a man who chose honor, even when it cost him everything." Drumming once again echoed through the plains. The Modoc Nation powwow became a yearly event of pride and remembrance. Warriors danced in regalia stitched with red, black, and gold, the colors of their homeland. Each beat of the drum was a heartbeat of history, a rhythm Captain Jack himself would have recognized. Over time, descendants of settlers and soldiers joined Modoc gatherings, extending hands once clenched in hostility. Together they walked the trails of the lava beds, reading the plaques, honoring both sides, not as enemies, but as humans who had suffered from misunderstanding and fear. Peace, at last, found its place among the stones. In the quiet of council lodges, the elders shared wisdom that bridged centuries. "We are not here because we won," one said. "We are here because we remembered." They reminded the young that survival is not weakness. It is the strongest form of victory. Captain Jack's story spread far beyond tribal borders. Teachers, filmmakers, and historians found in him a symbol of integrity, a leader who fought for peace and was punished for seeking justice. His name appeared in museums, documentaries, and even school curricula, ensuring the Modoc War would never again be reduced to a footnote. Every few years, Modoc families travel back to Oregon and California. They stand at Captain Jack's stronghold, close their eyes, and listen. The wind still carries faint echoes of the past, the cries, the prayers, the courage. Here, the past and present meet, and the circle of history closes. In Oklahoma, a new generation of Modoc leaders works in education, governance, and cultural revival. They teach their children to be proud of who they are, not as victims of history, but as keepers of strength. "The fire that burned in Captain Jack," one elder said, "did not die on the gallows. It burns in you." As years turn to decades, the Modoc Nation stands stronger than ever. Tribal sovereignty, language revival, and community programs flourish. Every October during Remembrance Week, they honor Captain Jack, not with mourning, but with gratitude. For though his body perished, his dream survived, to live free on their own land as their ancestors once did. The story of Captain Jack and the Modoc War is not just history. It is legacy. It speaks of courage in the face of impossible odds, of faith stronger than fear, of a people who refuse to vanish. When the sun sets over Tule Lake and the wind whispers through the lava beds, one can almost hear his voice, calm, defiant, eternal. "I am Captain Jack. I fought for my people, and we are still here." The story of Captain Jack and the Modoc people reminds us that courage can outlive conquest, and truth never dies in silence. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, comment, and share it so others can learn from this forgotten chapter of history. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss our next true story of resilience and humanity. Thank you for watching and for keeping the spirit of the Modoc alive.